Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to upgrade our player controller, implement jumping onto moving objects. We're going to create an abstraction to handle timers in our game, and we're also going to look at importing assets using code. If you watch for a bit and see anything that's helping you out, make sure to click the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Okay, lots to do today, so let's get into it. So Unity's character controller is fine for basic games, but for us, the only real advantage is that it has its own ground detection. In fact, it's going to cause physics problems when we start jumping onto moving objects. So we're going to start by upgrading our player controller to work with a rigid body. First, let's add a capsule collider with similar dimensions to what our character controller had, and then let's add a rigid body just sticking to the defaults. With those in place, we can collapse them up. And then let's jump into code and make a few changes. The first thing to do is grab a reference to our rigid body. So I'll just get a serialized field with the self attribute here. And we can remove the controller and we'll make some changes to replace where it was being called. In awake, let's set our rigid body freeze rotation to be true so that our player isn't tipping over. And let's add a vector 3 to hold all of our player input because we're going to be making all of our changes in fixed update instead of update. So in update, let's grab the player's input and store it in that variable. And let's add a fixed update method here. And the fixed update can now take care of all of our movement. So I'll just drag that down there. And we're also going to make a new method, handle jump, when we get to that point. So down here, let's take out where we were grabbing the input before and change our adjusted direction to use our new movement variable. Let's rename this method. We'll call it handle horizontal movement. And inside, let's calculate our velocity as the adjusted direction times move speed times time.fixed delta time. And then let's set the velocity on our rigid body. Back up and handle movement. If the magnitude of the adjusted direction was such that we aren't moving, let's come to a stop with the velocity. That'll give us a snappy feel to moving and we won't be sliding around. I'm going to remove the character controller now. And we should probably adjust our move speed now because we're using a rigid body. It's going to have to be quite a bit more powerful. So I'll move it up to 300 and let's give this a shot. So yeah, feels almost identical to what we had before. Camera's working fine too. Let's come out of play mode here and implement the one part of the character controller that we really need, which is the ground check. I can see I've got a typo there already. I'll go back and fix that in a minute. So I know already from testing that the distance from my player to the ground is 0.08 f. But yours may be different depending on what your settings are. So we want to have a layer mask. What are the ground layers? And then we just want to do a physics sphere cast. So we'll go down by the amount that we've set in the ground distance. And if we've found something there, then we'll set is grounded to be true, and that'll be a public property we can access. Just a little tidy up and fix that name. So all of the things that we want to jump on so far don't have a layer. So let's create a new layer. We'll just call it ground, and we'll add that to all of those objects. And then in our ground checker, let's set the ground layers to detect anything on the ground. Let's jump back into play mode. What I'm going to do is come up here to the context menu. I know it's kind of off my screen, but you can go into debug mode here so that we can actually see if is grounded is working correctly or not. So you can see as I walk around, it's always saying that I'm grounded. And if I change the distance here, it's going to not work because of the distance from my player to the ground is kind of fine. So this is the value that works for me. You might want to test it for yourself. If you find that you're not jumping, that may be why. You can also add some debug rays or whatever in there to help you figure it out if you like. So let's go back into normal mode. I'm just going to clean up the inspector a little bit and go back to the player controller and add a reference to the ground checker. There we go. Next up, we're going to create an abstraction for timers so that we don't have a bunch of floats and bools determining if we're jumping or not, or if the player's holding the jump button and for how long. So this will be in the repository as well, of course, but I'll just write it quickly here and you'll be able to see how it works when we implement our jump in a moment. So we'll have an abstract class timer. The timer is going to have an initial time and a current time. It'll know if it's running or not. It'll have some actions it can fire. So when it starts, it could do something. When it stops, it could do something. We'll let it tell us its progress. All timers will have a public method start that'll just start the timer running and invoke its method. It'll also have similarly a stop method. Well, might as well add a resume and a pause here just in case. You don't necessarily need that. But the most important thing here is that we have to pass it in delta time every update. So every timer has to tick during an update. So we're going to make two kinds of timers. One's a countdown cooldown. So we'll start at a value and go downwards to 0. So when we instantiate it in the constructor, let's take a value and pass that into the base. And then our tick method is just going to count down by delta time. So as long as it's running and we're not at 0 time, go downwards. If we are at 0 time and we're running, then we need to fire off our event and basically we'll stop. So we can add a couple more methods here. Is finished. We could reset to the initial time. We could also reset to a different time if we wanted to. And I think that's sufficient for that. That's a pretty sophisticated cooldown. Stopwatch timer, Copilot already knows what I want to do, except instead of passing in a value, we're going to pass in 0 because stopwatches will count from 0 up to infinity, and they'll be able to reset and return their time. And yeah, that's it. Well, let's go back to the player controller and put these to use. Hopefully that wasn't too quick, but it's in the repository if you just want to grab it from there if you're following along and don't want to type it out. If you've been finding this series interesting or useful so far, make sure you hit that like button. Helps me know what kind of content to keep making. Okay, back here in the player controller, let's keep a list of timers. So create that list and import dependencies. And then we're also going to have 2 countdown timers. One countdown timer is going to be how long the player's been pressing the button. The other one is going to be in case we want to cool down after the jump is done. So let's change our header up here to movement settings and make another one for jump settings because we're going to want to define a few things in Unity. One will be jump force. Another one will be jump cooldown, which I'll set to 0 just in case we don't want it to cool down at all. Jump timer duration, or let's just call it jump duration. So we'll say half a second is how long the player can hold the button. And let's say jump max height for when we're calculating the actual velocity in the beginning. And let's get a gravity multiplier in case we want to bring them down to the ground faster than normal. And then we're going to keep a jump velocity all the time. So we'll just put that by our regular horizontal velocity variable there. In Awake, we're going to set up our timers. So let's say our jump timer is a new countdown timer of jump duration, and the cooldown timer is a new countdown timer of jump cooldown. Let's create a new list of capacity 2 that's going to hold our jump timer and our jump cooldown timer. Now, if you see here, you can set a capacity for lists when you initialize them. Whenever you add something to a list and it exceeds its capacity, it has to double in size, and then it has to copy everything from your list to another location in memory. So if you already know the capacity for a list, it can be a good idea for you to define it ahead of time. If it does go over that, it's fine too, but in our case, we know we're going to have 2 timers here. Let's add to our on timer stop event in the jump timer to immediately start the cooldown timer. So every time we finish a jump, start the cooldown. Okay, that's our timers handled. Let's come back over to the input reader. Let's define a new Unity action with type bool. We'll set it to have an empty delegate down here in the onJump method. It's going to be exactly the same as our onMouseControl camera. When the button is pressed, we're going to invoke true. When it's released, we'll invoke false. Let's go back to the player controller. In onEnable and onDisable, let's register to those events with a new method onJump, and it'll accept the Boolean whether it was performed or not. Now here's where we can have all of our logic that determines whether or not we can jump. So whether the button's pressed, whether our jump timer is running. So if we're already jumping, we're not going to jump. If the cooldown's running, we're not going to jump. And we need to make sure that we're grounded. So if we pass all of those checks, we can start the jump timer, and that means we are jumping. Otherwise, if it's canceled and the jump timer was running, we're going to stop the jump timer. As I mentioned before, in the update method, we need to handle ticking our timers. So let's just make a method for that, and let's uncomment our handle jump method, and we'll write these quickly. Handle timers is simple. Just iterate over every timer and call the tick method by passing in time.delta time to it. So that'll keep all of our timers running in sync with the rest of the game. And then we need our handle jump method. Now, handle jump method, the way I'd like to set this up is to have an initial burst of speed and then lower the velocity a little bit over time until the jump is over, at which point gravity takes over. First of all, if the timer is not running and we are grounded, let's set the velocity to 0 and stop the timer. That means we're on the ground and we're not jumping at all. That'll just keep it at 0, and then we bail out of the handle jump early. After that, let's figure out how we're actually going to jump. So if we're jumping or falling, let's figure out what to do. The first situation is that we've just started the jump. And so what I'd like to do is, for the first 10% of the progress of the timer, I'd like to apply a fairly decent amount of force. So what I'm going to say is the launch point is 0.9. That means from 100% to 90% as we're counting down the progress. That first 10% is where I want to get the most force. So as long as the progress is greater than that, so somewhere between 0.9 and 1, then we're going to do a little physics calculation here that would figure out how much velocity we actually need to achieve the jump maximum height based on our gravity that's set in the game. So once we know that, I'll just add a little comment here quickly. Maybe I'll put an annotation in here after I'm done editing. Okay, so if we're past the launch point there, so we're below 90%, but we're still jumping, we're just going to apply a little bit less all the time. So I'll just change the velocity by 1 minus the progress multiplied by the jump force we have set in the editor over fixed delta time. So I'll just slowly get us up to the apex of the jump. And otherwise, the timer is over, or the players let go of the button. So let gravity take over and then apply it to the rigid body. Now, this jump calculation might be slightly more complicated than we even need. You could just calculate the initial velocity, send it up, and then constantly apply gravity to it as well. That would work fine if you want something simpler. But as we all know, player controls require a lot of tweaking. So why don't we just jump into the editor and see how it looks. Okay, so I can do a little jump and release, and I can do a longer jump. I can run and jump. We'll have to do something about the walking animation while jumping, I think. It feels okay. We can keep tweaking this as we go. Next, we got to bring in some moving platforms. And to move platforms, I want to use a tweening library, which is doTween. So this is a free asset, but instead of importing it from the package manager, what I'd like to do here is keep working on our setup tool. So last video, we started working on this setup tool that would create folders, and now we're going to expand it to be able to bring in assets. So before we can do this, you have to download doTween. There's a link in the description. And as long as you have it downloaded to your local machine, you'll be able to import it with code. Okay, let's create a static class. We'll call it assets. Now, assets really just needs one method at the moment, and that will be to import an asset. To import an asset, we need to know where it is on your local machine. So we need to know the name of it. We need to know the subfolder under the Unity folders that's holding all your assets. And I'm just going to paste mine in here. Yours will be similar. It's usually in appdata/roaming/Unity, something similar to mine there. And then we're going to use the asset database import package method. We just combine the folder, subfolder, and the asset name and set interactive to false. And then we can make a menu item for this. So let's make a public method here. We'll just make a public static. We'll call it, let's call it import my favorite assets. And we only have the one asset that we need right now. So let's just make a one-liner here. We'll go assets.import asset. And we need to get in those values. Now, I already have them off screen here. I'm just going to paste them in. So that's the name of the package as it's found in my Windows folder. And it's in a subfolder of my Unity folders called, or my Unity assets folder called Demi Giant /scripting animation. So you'll have to go and find yours for each of those. And then let's just make a menu item for it. Let's call it import my favorite assets. I'm going to paste one more example in here for you to have a look at. And this is one that I do just for basic project setups. This will be almost all the assets I like to put into every package. So if you have a look here, I've got Odin Inspector and Validator, Editor Console Pro, and a couple other ones, Chronex Color Studio. Selection History is a really good one from Stagger Creations. So I'm not going to leave this in the repository, but if you wanted to see, that's just how you can import a whole bunch of assets at once. You could go grab a coffee and come back. And, you know, if it's a lot, you might have to come back in half an hour, but it will do them all at once. And you don't have to go and find them all and click them all. Now I've deleted DoTween in my project, so you can see I've got a little red arrow there, but let's go up to our menu here under Tools, Setup, and we'll click our new Import My Favorite Assets. And I'm going to speed this up a little bit because it does take about a minute to run. We'll come back, no more error. We've got DoTween in our project, and we can get on with making some moving platforms. Yeah, I'm going to start by bringing in just a 3D cube that we'll use for our platform. Now, it's important to remember that if you change the shape of this 3D cube and you try to parent the player underneath it, it's going to assume the shape of or whatever the scale is that you've set on it. So let's put the platform under a parent that we'll call moving platform. And let's just slide it over. And now the platform can be whatever shape we want, but its parent is always going to be 1, 1, 1. So I'll just change it like so. We are going to need some scripts. We're going to need 2 scripts, actually. One is going to allow our player to know if they're on top of a platform or not. And we need another script that will handle actually moving a platform around. So we'll call one Platform Collision Handler, and we'll call the other one Platform Mover. Let's put this into its own class. So Platform Mover is going to use the asset that we just brought in, our tweening engine. So let's import that at the top. And this is really going to be pretty straightforward, although we do want to customize it a little bit in the editor. So let's have a vector 3 where we actually want it to move to from its starting position, and how long we want it to move for, and an easing method. So these platforms are just going to be one way and back. So we record the start position in the start method, and then let's call another method move, and move will run our tween. And the tween is just going to move from one place to the other place over amount of time using the ease method. And then I'm going to get rid of this last part that Copilot wanted. Instead, let's set a loop to loop infinite, which is -1, and we can do a yo-yo effect. So the platform's just going to go back and forth between the start position and whatever we set to its move to position. That's really it for that one. Let's come back. Platform Collision Handler. When we collide with a platform, we want that platform to become the parent of the player. So this component is going to live on the player, and we're going to keep track of which platform we're on. So on collision enter, if it has a tag of platform, actually let's change that. Let's call it moving platform, because maybe we'll have some static platforms. So if it's a moving platform, we'll set the parent of our transform to be the platform. And if we're exiting the collision of a moving platform, then we're going to set our parent to null. Let's just make one change here. We only really want to parent to a platform if we land on it from above. So let's check the contact point. If the contact normal is pointing up, we know that we've come onto it from above. So if it's not that, let's just bail out. I think that this will suffice for that. We'll have to make some changes in the editor here because we don't have a tag for this. So let's add the scripts first here. So we'll add our platform handler first, platform collision handler. So there's nothing really to do with that. There's no settings, but let's add a tag here for our platforms. So moving platform, and we need to add our platform mover. There it is. Let's not forget to set the tag. Let's make it move a little bit on the x-axis. Let's change it to 3 so it's a little bit more dramatic. 1's kind of too small. Now, the box that we added before has a collider, but we don't want it to collide with the child. We want to collide with the parent. So let's add a box collider to the parent moving platform, and we'll just make it the same shape as the model. So we could do this with code. Maybe that's something we can add later, but for now, I'll just hard code these values in there. Let's duplicate it, and let's make one that goes up and down instead of left and right. So instead of our move to X3, let's change it to Y2, say. That'll give us a variety to test out with. And let's jump into play mode and try it. Okay, the movement looks good. So there's one more thing to change, and that is we need ground detection on these. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to jump off of them. So we don't need to change the children, just the objects that actually have colliders on them. So with that done, so let's see if I can actually get onto one of these. Yeah, there we go. Okay, moving up and down, no problem. I can move around on it. And let's jump on to the other one. Oh, missed. Now it's just pushing me around. Here we go. Yep. Okay, moving back and forth. Might help if I put some materials on here. Maybe I'll do that later. Anyway, working as expected. This looks pretty good, actually. I think we should be able to build a pretty interesting environment with this. So I think that's where we're going to stop for today. In the next episode, we're going to start implementing some gameplay mechanics, picking up items, getting a score, maybe collecting coins, that kind of thing. So hit that subscribe button if you're interested in seeing more videos like this, and I'll see you in the comments below.